When the world decides you are nothing, even the wind sounds like rejection. Emily Carter heard those words in her mind as she stood at the edge of Blackridge Village, the wooden gate closing behind her with a final, echoing thud that felt heavier than iron. Snow had begun to fall in thin, reluctant flakes, drifting through the gray sky like the world itself was forgetting her existence. No one had stopped her. No one had called her name. That was the rule for Omegas like her. Quiet departure, quiet erasure. She tightened her thin coat around her shoulders, the fabric barely protecting her from the sharp winter air blowing in from the northern forest. At 21, Emily had learned that being an Omega did not always mean weakness of heart, but it almost always meant invisibility in the eyes of others. You were never meant for anything greater than this road, the village elder had said earlier, not unkindly, but without hesitation, as if speaking a fact written into stone. Now the road stretched ahead of her, disappearing into a line of frost-covered trees that looked like they were waiting for something to be lost inside them. Emily lowered her gaze and began walking, her boots crunching softly against frozen ground, each step pulling her farther away from the only place she had ever called home. The wind shifted suddenly as she entered the forest's edge, and the trees closed behind her like silent witnesses. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became, until even the memory of human voices felt distant. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time behaved strangely when loneliness was the only companion. Snow thickened into a steady fall, and the forest became a blur of white and shadow. Emily's breath grew shallow, visible in pale clouds that dissolved into the cold. She should have turned back, any sensible person would have, but there was nowhere left to return to. That was when she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the rhythm of winter. A low, broken breath carried through the trees, almost swallowed by the wind but not quite gone. Emily froze. Her instincts, quiet but persistent, pulled her forward instead of away. She followed the sound, carefully, stepping between roots and fallen branches until the forest opened into a small clearing. There, half buried in snow, lay a massive black wolf. Its body was still, too still to be resting, its fur dusted with frost that clung like glass. Yet its eyes were open, not wild, not empty, watching. Something inside Emily tightened. She should have been afraid. Every story she had ever heard warned of wolves in these woods, creatures that did not hesitate, that did not spare. But this one looked like it was holding onto the last thread of something human. Slowly, carefully, Emily knelt despite the biting cold seeping through her knees. She reached into her satchel with trembling fingers and pulled out the small flask of water she had been saving since morning. It was all she had left. "I don't know if you understand me," she whispered softly, her voice barely louder than the falling snow, "but you look like you need this more than I do." The wolf did not move, but its gaze sharpened, as if listening beyond sound itself. Emily hesitated only a moment longer before tipping the flask forward, letting a thin stream of water fall onto her palm first, then lowering it closer to the creature's muzzle. The forest held its breath, and in that stillness, something impossible began to shift in the silence between them. The forest remained still after her whisper, as if the entire world was waiting for a decision that did not belong to nature alone. Emily Carter kept her hand steady, though every instinct in her body urged her to pull back from the massive black wolf lying in the snow. Its eyes never left her face, sharp and unblinking, carrying a depth that did not feel animal in the way she had been taught to expect. Slowly, the creature shifted its head forward, not with aggression, but with an exhausted kind of trust that made her breath catch. The moment its muzzle touched her palm, something warm surged through her hand, unexpected and gentle, like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Emily froze, unsure if she had imagined it, but the sensation deepened, spreading faintly up her arm before fading into the cold air. The wolf drank from her hand in small, careful movements, as though the act itself required more strength than it had left to give. Each drop of water seemed to change something subtle in the stillness around them, like the forest itself was listening more closely now. Emily did not speak again. She simply remained there, kneeling in the snow, holding what little she could offer. The wolf's breathing began to steady, its chest rising with less strain, and for a moment, its eyes softened in a way that made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion she could not name. The wind shifted through the trees, but instead of cold, Emily felt a strange warmth gathering in the space between them, faint and impossible, like a memory she had never lived. Far beyond the clearing, hidden beneath the endless stretch of winter forest, something ancient stirred in silence. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence, as though the act of kindness had reached further than it should have. Emily did not notice it at first. She was too focused on the creature in front of her, on the way its gaze no longer looked purely lost, but aware. Then it happened. A faint shimmer of light flickered across the wolf's fur, subtle and almost indistinguishable from the falling snow, but real enough to make Emily blink in disbelief. She leaned forward slightly, unsure if exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind, yet the wolf did not retreat. Instead, it held her gaze with growing intensity, as if recognizing something in her that she herself had never seen. Emily's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from a quiet confusion that settled deep in her chest. The forest grew quieter, the snowfall slowing as though time itself had begun to hesitate. The wolf exhaled slowly, and in that breath, Emily felt something echo back into her, a faint resonance that did not belong to thought or language, but to something older. Her fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew her hand, though she did not fully step away. The connection, whatever it was, did not break. It lingered in the air between them, invisible but undeniable. In the distance, unseen beyond the trees, a consciousness that had been dormant for far too long began to acknowledge a change it could not ignore. And in the center of the silent clearing, Emily Carter remained on her knees beside a creature that was no longer entirely what it appeared to be, while the world around them seemed to hold its breath for what would come next. The silence in the clearing did not remain empty for long, as if the world itself refused to allow such a moment to exist without consequence. Emily Carter stayed kneeling in the snow, her breath slow and uneven, her eyes fixed on the massive black wolf in front of her. The faint shimmer she had seen before did not disappear. Instead, it deepened slightly, tracing along the wolf's fur like a distant pulse of light beneath frozen water. The creature's gaze remained locked on her, no longer only watching but studying, as though every breath she took carried meaning it had forgotten until now. Emily's fingers curled slightly into the snow beside her, uncertain whether she should move or remain perfectly still. The forest around them felt different, as if the trees had shifted their attention inward, listening. The wind that had been constant moments ago softened into irregular whispers between the branches. The wolf exhaled again, slower this time, and Emily noticed something subtle yet impossible. Its breathing was becoming steadier, more controlled, as though her presence alone was anchoring it to something it had nearly lost. She swallowed quietly, her voice hesitant when she finally spoke, though she did not expect an answer. "You are not just a wolf, are you?" The words vanished into the cold air, but the moment she said them, the wolf's eyes narrowed slightly, not in aggression, but in recognition. A faint pressure shifted in the atmosphere, like the space between heartbeats stretching longer than it should. Emily felt it then, not as sound or sight, but as a sensation deep within her chest, like standing too close to something vast and ancient without understanding its shape. Far away, beyond the clearing and deeper into the endless forest, a second presence stirred faintly, as if responding to an echo it had not heard in a very long time. It was not loud, not physical, but unmistakably aware. Emily did not know it, but the moment of kindness she had shown was no longer contained to this single place. The wolf in front of her shifted slightly, lifting its head a fraction higher than before, and for the briefest instant, the outline of something human seemed to flicker behind its form, not fully revealed, but suggested like a memory refusing to stay buried. Emily's breath caught, and she leaned back slightly, unsure if what she was seeing was real or imagined, but the wolf did not move away. Instead, it remained still, as though waiting for her reaction to define what came next. The snow continued to fall gently, but even it seemed slower now, drifting in wider, softer arcs. Emily's heartbeat grew louder in her ears, not from fear, but from the strange realization that whatever stood before her was not simply surviving. It was becoming aware in a way that defied explanation. The forest held its silence even deeper, and in that suspended moment, Something long forgotten within the black wolf began to answer her presence, not with words, but with recognition that felt older than names, older than kingdoms, and far more powerful than either of them understood. The moment stretched in a way that no natural law in the forest seemed willing to explain, as Emily Carter remained frozen in the snow, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the massive black wolf that now felt less like a creature and more like a presence aware of itself in a way that should not have been possible. The faint shimmer beneath its fur grew slightly stronger, not bright enough to illuminate the clearing, but enough to suggest something hidden beneath the surface, something waiting. Emily's hands trembled as she slowly lowered them into her lap, unsure whether moving would break whatever fragile connection was forming between them. The wolf did not step back. Instead, it shifted its weight forward slightly, as if drawn by something subtle in her stillness. A quiet pressure filled the air, not physical, but emotional, like the sensation of standing at the edge of a storm before the first sound of thunder. Emily's thoughts became unsteady. She had come into this forest expecting silence, isolation, and perhaps danger, but nothing had prepared her for the feeling that she was being seen not just by eyes, but by something deeper that seemed to recognize her in a way no living creature ever had before. The wolf's gaze softened for a brief moment, and in that softness Emily felt an unexpected pull in her chest, as though an invisible thread had formed between them, without permission or warning. She whispered again without realizing it, her voice barely audible. "What are you?" The question did not receive words, yet the reaction was immediate. The air around the wolf seemed to tighten for a fraction of a second, as if responding internally rather than externally. The shimmer along its body flickered unevenly, and for a brief instant, Emily swore she saw something beyond the shape of the animal, a silhouette that did not belong to any natural creature she had ever known, something upright, fractured, and incomplete like a memory struggling to surface through deep water. Her breath caught sharply, and she leaned back slightly, not in fear but in disbelief, unable to fully process what her eyes and instincts were telling her at the same time. The forest around them remained silent, but that silence was no longer empty. It felt aware, almost respectful, as if every branch and snowfall had become part of a witness to something unfolding that was not meant to be seen. The wolf lowered its head again slowly, not in weakness this time, but in emotion that felt deliberate, almost like acknowledgement. Emily felt the strange energy between them intensify, a quiet resonance that made her pulse steady even as her mind struggled to understand it. Somewhere far beyond the clearing, beyond the reach of sight or sound, something ancient and distant seemed to react faintly, as though a signal long thought lost had been answered. Emily did not know that her presence here had disrupted something far larger than the forest itself. She only knew that the creature in front of her was no longer simply a wounded animal, and that whatever she had done by offering water and kindness had reached deeper than reason could explain. The wolf remained still, watching her without blinking, as if waiting for a decision that would determine more than just the moment they were in, while the snow continued to fall around them like a quiet veil separating what was known from what had just begun to awaken. The stillness between Emily Carter and the black wolf began to change in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like the slow shifting of ice on a frozen lake before it cracks. The air no longer felt purely cold. It carried a faint pressure, subtle but persistent, as though something within the clearing was beginning to recognize itself through her presence. Emily remained kneeling, her body tense but no longer driven by fear alone. Instead, a quiet uncertainty had taken root in her chest, the kind that comes when reality stops behaving according to everything you were taught to expect. The wolf's breathing, once shallow and fragile, had grown more stable, each inhale and exhale measured with a strange sense of awareness that did not belong to instinct alone. Its eyes never left hers, and in that unwavering gaze, Emily felt something she could not name begin to form between them. The snow continued to fall, but even it seemed less chaotic now, drifting in softer, slower patterns that made the world feel suspended in an unnatural pause. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the ground as she steadied herself, her voice barely more than a whisper when she spoke again without knowing why. "You are still here," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. The wolf responded by lifting its head a fraction higher, and in that simple motion, the shimmer beneath its fur pulsed again, stronger than before, like a heartbeat echoing through something larger than its physical form. Emily's breath caught, and for the first time, she felt not like an outsider observing a wounded creature, but like someone standing on the edge of a truth that had been waiting for her specifically. The forest around them seemed to respond in kind, the trees holding still as though unwilling to interrupt what was unfolding. Then, without warning, the wolf's body tensed slightly, not in aggression but in strain, as if something inside it was resisting or struggling against an unseen barrier. Emily instinctively leaned forward, concern overriding hesitation. "It is okay," she said softly, though she had no way of knowing if it was true. The moment her voice reached him, the shimmer intensified, spreading briefly along the wolf's form in a faint ripple of light that startled her into stillness. For a split second, the outline of the creature seemed to blur, not transforming, but destabilizing, as if reality itself was uncertain about what it was meant to show. Emily's heart began to race, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming sense that what stood before her was connected to something far beyond this forest, something vast and deeply buried beneath the surface of the world she knew. The wolf exhaled slowly, and in that breath, Emily felt a resonance echo through her own body, faint but undeniable, like a distant call responding to a forgotten signal. Her thoughts scattered as she tried to understand what was happening, but understanding slipped further away with every passing second. The clearing remained silent, yet it no longer felt empty. It felt observed, as though unseen eyes from somewhere beyond were beginning to turn toward this exact moment. Emily did not move, neither did the wolf, and between them, something invisible continued to awaken, stretching across the boundary of what was known, while the snow fell quietly over a moment that no longer belonged entirely to the natural world. The clearing seemed to narrow around Emily Carter, as if the forest itself was gently closing in to protect a secret it was no longer willing to hide. The black wolf remained in front of her, but something about its presence had changed again, no longer only wounded or watchful, but deeply focused, as though every sound in the world beyond the trees had begun to matter less than the space between them. Emily could feel it now, not just in her thoughts but in her body, a quiet vibration that had no source she could identify, like standing too close to a distant bell that was not yet ringing. She shifted slightly in the snow, her legs growing numb, yet she did not move away. The connection between them had become impossible to ignore, stretching like an invisible thread that tightened every time she tried to understand it. The wolf lowered its head briefly, and when it lifted it again, the shimmer beneath its fur surged stronger than before, spreading in faint waves that no longer looked like illusion. Emily's breath caught as she noticed the air itself reacting, the snowfall thinning above the clearing in a subtle circular pattern, as if something above them was pressing downward with unseen awareness. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the growing certainty that she was no longer alone in a simple forest encounter. Somewhere far beyond her perception, in a place she could not name or see, something ancient and powerful had begun to respond to what was happening here. The wolf's eyes sharpened again, but this time there was a flicker of something deeper behind them, not pain, not instinct, but recognition forming slowly like a memory returning after a very long silence. Emily swallowed, her voice barely steady as she whispered, "You are not just a wolf, are you?" The words seemed to linger in the air longer than they should have, and in that lingering, the wolf's body went still in a way that felt intentional rather than reactive. The shimmer along its form intensified, tracing faint lines that resembled structure beneath the surface, as if reality itself was struggling to maintain consistency around what stood before her. Emily felt a strange pressure behind her eyes, like her senses were being asked to expand beyond what they were designed to perceive. She did not understand it, but she no longer felt separate from it either. The forest, the snow, the silence, and the creature before her all seemed to be part of the same unfolding awareness. The wolf exhaled slowly, and in that exhale, Emily felt a pulse of energy move through the space between them, subtle yet undeniable, like the echo of something vast shifting its attention for the first time in ages. Her hand instinctively lifted slightly from the ground, not to touch, but as if responding to something calling from within the silence. The moment she moved, the shimmer across the wolf brightened. Briefly, and the outline of something far greater than its physical form flickered once more beneath the surface, unstable but increasingly present. Emily's thoughts grew quiet, not empty, but focused, as though her mind had been drawn into the same stillness that surrounded them. The clearing no longer felt like a place in the forest. It felt like a boundary, thin and fragile, separating what was known from what was beginning to awaken beyond it. And in that suspended moment, both Emily Carter and the Black Wolf remained perfectly still, bound together by something neither of them had chosen, while the world beyond the trees began to shift in response to a truth that was slowly, inevitably, coming alive. The moment before everything changed felt almost like silence holding its breath too tightly, as Emily Carter remained kneeling in the snow beside the Black Wolf, unaware that the boundary between what was real and what was hidden was beginning to dissolve in ways she could no longer reverse. The air around them grew heavier, not in weight, but in meaning, as though the clearing had become a point where something distant and forgotten was finally aligning with the present. The wolf did not move, yet its presence felt increasingly impossible to define as purely physical. The shimmer beneath its fur pulsed again, no longer faint or uncertain, but steady, like a rhythm trying to re-establish itself after being lost for too long. Emily's breathing slowed without her intention, as if her body was responding to the same unseen force shaping the space between them. She felt it before she understood it, a pressure forming in the silence, not threatening but absolute, as if something vast had finally turned its attention fully toward this moment. The forest around them reacted in subtle ways, the falling snow shifting direction slightly, circling above the clearing in patterns that did not belong to natural wind. Emily's eyes widened slightly as she noticed the wolf's body beginning to change in the smallest possible ways, not transforming outright, but resisting something that had held it in place. The outline of its form seemed to blur at the edges, as if the concept of what it was had become unstable. Emily instinctively leaned back a few inches, her hands pressing into the cold ground for balance. But she did not retreat further. Something within her refused to break the connection, even as uncertainty grew heavier in her mind. The wolf's eyes remained locked onto hers, and within them, she saw something she had not seen before, not just awareness, but intention forming beneath the surface of suffering. A low, almost imperceptible vibration passed through the air, and Emily felt it resonate through her chest, not as sound but as recognition, like an echo answering a call that had existed long before she arrived here. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, fragile and uncertain. "What is happening?" The question was not answered in words, yet the response was immediate in feeling. The shimmer beneath the wolf's fur expanded outward in a slow wave, and for the briefest moment, the silhouette beneath its form sharpened into something more structured, something that defied the limits of a single shape. Emily's breath caught as the sensation of scale changed, as if the presence before her was no longer confined to the body she could see. The clearing seemed to tighten around them, the trees standing still in a way that suggested awareness rather than absence of movement. Then, without warning, the wolf exhaled deeply, and in that breath, the entire atmosphere shifted as if a threshold had been crossed. Emily felt it clearly, not as fear, but as realization that something long hidden had begun to acknowledge its own return. The wolf's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, and in that softness, Emily understood without knowing how that nothing about this encounter had been accidental. The forest remained silent, but it was no longer empty of meaning. It was waiting, along with everything else, for whatever came next. The silence that followed was no longer the kind of silence Emily Carter had known in her life before, because it felt alive in a way that pressed gently but firmly against her awareness, as though the entire clearing had become a single listening presence. She remained kneeling in the snow, her hands now still. At her sides, her eyes fixed on the Black Wolf, whose form no longer felt entirely anchored to the rules of the natural world. The shimmer beneath its fur had stabilized into a steady, almost rhythmic glow, faint but undeniable, like a heartbeat that belonged to something far larger than a single body. Emily's thoughts had slowed into something more focused, less like confusion and more like quiet acceptance of the fact that whatever stood before her had already crossed a threshold she could not define. The wolf's gaze did not waver, and in that gaze she felt no hostility, no fear, only a depth of recognition that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. The snowfall above them had changed again, forming a wider and more deliberate circle, as if the sky itself had begun to revolve around this exact point in the forest. Emily's breath came slowly as she whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "If you understand me in any way, I am still here." The words felt fragile in the cold air, yet they did not disappear the way normal words should. Instead, they seemed to settle into the space between them, and in response the wolf's body tensed slightly, not in aggression, but in something closer to recognition turning inward. The shimmer intensified for a brief moment, and Emily felt a sudden wave of pressure pass through her senses, not painful, but overwhelming in its clarity, as if something vast had briefly brushed against the edges of her awareness. She instinctively closed her eyes for a second, and in that instant she felt it more strongly, a presence layered behind the wolf, not separate from it, but intertwined with it in a way that defied simple explanation. When she opened her eyes again, the creature before her seemed even less like an ordinary wolf and more like a boundary between two states of being that had not yet resolved. The forest around them remained completely still, no wind, no sound of movement, only the soft persistence of falling snow that now felt almost intentional in its rhythm. Emily slowly shifted her weight, her legs numb from the cold, but she did not stand. Something held her in place, not physically, but emotionally, as though leaving would mean breaking something she did not yet understand. The wolf exhaled again, and this time the breath carried a subtle distortion in the air, like reality bending slightly before settling back into place. Emily felt her heartbeat respond to it, not in fear, but in synchronization, as though her body had begun to attune itself to something beyond normal perception. A faint realization formed in her mind that what she was witnessing was not simply transformation or recovery, but awakening in a deeper sense, something that had been waiting beneath layers of concealment for far longer than she could imagine. The wolf's eyes softened once more, and within that softness Emily felt an unspoken acknowledgement pass between them, as if her presence had become a catalyst for something that could no longer remain dormant. The clearing seemed to hold its breath once again, and in that suspended stillness, Emily Carter understood without words that whatever stood before her was no longer only responding to her kindness, but beginning to remember something it had lost, while the boundary between human and myth quietly continued to dissolve around them. The clearing no longer felt like a place in the ordinary world, but like a threshold where something ancient and forgotten had finally begun to surface after an impossible silence. Emily Carter remained kneeling in the snow, her body still, her breath slow, her eyes locked on the black wolf that had changed in ways no natural explanation could contain. The shimmer beneath its fur had grown into a steady, controlled glow, no longer flickering like an illusion, but pulsing with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost conscious. The air around them was no longer cold in the way winter should be. Instead, it carried a strange tension, like the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation of a truth that had been delayed for too long. Emily felt it before she understood it, a pressure building in the space between them, subtle but absolute, as if reality itself was preparing to shift its shape. The wolf's gaze deepened, no longer simply watching her, but fully acknowledging her presence as something significant to what was unfolding. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the snow, though she did not pull away. Something within her resisted fear, even as her instincts told her she was standing at the edge of something beyond comprehension. The shimmer along the wolf's body intensified one final time, not spreading outward but concentrating inward, as though gathering everything it had been hiding into a single point of truth. Emily's heartbeat slowed in response, not from calmness but from a strange alignment she could not explain, as though her body was beginning to understand something her mind had not yet reached. The forest itself seemed to retreat into stillness, so complete it felt unnatural, as if every living thing beyond the clearing had turned away to avoid witnessing what came next. The wolf exhaled deeply, and in that breath, the transformation of perception reached its peak. The outline of its form no longer held steady, and for a brief and impossible moment, Emily saw not a creature bound by shape, but a presence layered with something far greater, something that carried the weight of forgotten identity and lost authority. She did not understand the meaning of what she saw, but she understood its significance in a way that bypassed thought entirely. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because language felt inadequate in the presence of something that had begun to redefine itself in real time. The snow above them slowed even further, drifting in near silence, as if the world itself was delaying its next movement to observe what would be revealed. Emily felt a final pulse of resonance pass between them, not as sound, not as vision, but as recognition fully formed. And in that final moment of stillness, she understood without being told that the creature before her had never truly been only a wolf, and that her simple act of kindness had not merely saved a life, but awakened something that the world had long since forgotten how to name, while the clearing remained suspended in a silence that now carried the weight of destiny itself.